History remembers her as Hürrem Sultan, the woman who transformed the Ottoman court forever. But long before she wore silk robes, advised emperors, or became one of the most influential women in Islamic history, she was simply a young girl whose entire world vanished almost overnight. The exact details of her childhood remain uncertain. Most respected historians believe she was born around 1505 in the region of Ruthenia, near present-day western Ukraine. Many later sources identify her birth name as Alexandra or Anastasia, though no contemporary Ottoman record confirms either name with certainty. Even the girl who would one day shape an empire begins as a mystery. And perhaps that mystery is where her legend truly begins. Imagine waking one morning believing your future is already written, only for strangers on horseback to erase it before sunset. During the early 15th century, the lands north of the Black Sea were constantly threatened by Crimean Tatar slave raids. Villages disappeared without warning, families were torn apart in moments, children vanished, mothers searched in vain, fathers fought battles they could never win. It was a brutal reality of Eastern Europe, feeding one of the largest slave trades of the age. Somewhere within that violence, the young girl who would become Hurrem was captured. We do not know her final words to her family. We do not know whether she ever saw them again. History falls silent here, but silence often hides the deepest tragedies. Bound with countless other captives, she was taken across long roads towards Crimea, where slave markets determined the value of human lives with frightening indifference. Strength, age, beauty, health, every glance from a buyer carried the power to decide an entire future. Few could have imagined that among those frightened captives stood a girl who would one day influence the most powerful ruler of the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, she was brought to Constantinople, the magnificent imperial capital known today as Istanbul. Before her rose soaring domes, crowded harbors, glittering palaces, and the vast court of Sultan Suleiman, whose empire stretched across 3 continents. But entering the imperial palace did not guarantee power. It meant entering a world governed by discipline, hierarchy, intelligence, and constant uncertainty. Hundreds of young women lived inside the imperial harem, not merely as companions, as popular fiction often suggests, but within a highly organized institution where they were educated in languages, etiquette, religion, music, poetry, embroidery, and palace protocol. Every word mattered. Every mistake could end a future before it truly began. Most would never rise beyond obscurity. Some would spend their entire lives forgotten behind palace walls. Yet among them was one young woman whose laughter would soon earn her a new name, Hurrem. In Ottoman Turkish, it meant the joyful one or the cheerful one, a remarkable name for someone who had already lost everything. And in the next chapter, that cheerful smile would do something few believed possible. It would capture the attention of the most powerful man in the Islamic world. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with an army, but with a single glance. Within the walls of Topkapi Palace, every smile was measured, every word observed, and every ambition carefully concealed. The Imperial Harem was not simply a place of luxury, it was one of the most disciplined institutions in the Ottoman Empire. Behind its ornate doors, hundreds of women lived under strict rules, knowing that a single mistake could erase any hope of advancement. Yet, hidden within those marble corridors, history was quietly preparing an unexpected turning point. Among the many young women was Hürrem, the cheerful girl from Ruthenia. Unlike others, contemporary observers and later Ottoman traditions repeatedly describe her as possessing an unusually lively spirit. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and remarkably resilient. Her greatest strength was not simply her beauty, it was her ability to make others feel at ease. And in a palace where silence was often safer than laughter, that quality made her unforgettable. Then came the moment that would alter both of their lives. Exactly when Sultan Suleiman I, later remembered as Suleiman the Magnificent, first noticed Hürrem is not recorded. History offers no dramatic dialogue, no eyewitness description of their first meeting, but the outcome is beyond dispute. Somehow, among hundreds of women, she captured the attention of the ruler whose empire stretched from Hungary to Arabia, from North Africa to the Persian frontier. That alone was extraordinary, but what happened next was almost unimaginable. Until then, Ottoman tradition favored distance. A concubine who bore the Sultan a son usually left Istanbul with her child once he was appointed governor of a province. This custom helped prevent any single woman from dominating palace politics. It had existed for generations. Few dared question it. Hurrem would become the exception. One child became two became three, then four, then five, and eventually at least 6 children are attributed to her, including the future Sultan Suleiman II. Each birth quietly broke another expectation. Each passing year strengthened a bond that many within the palace struggled to understand. But admiration has always carried a dangerous shadow. Where one woman rises, another often fears she must fall. Standing across Hurrem's path was Mahidevran Hatun, the mother of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest surviving son. Mustafa was widely admired, brave, capable, and deeply respected by both soldiers and provincial administrators. Many believed his future was already secure. Then Hurrem arrived. Whispers spread through the palace like smoke. Servants noticed changing routines. Officials exchanged cautious glances. Foreign ambassadors began sending curious reports back to Europe, wondering why the Sultan seemed unusually devoted to one particular woman. No one could yet see the full picture, but everyone sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding. Then came the incident that palace chroniclers and later historians would remember for centuries. According to several historical accounts, tensions between Hürrem and Mahidevran eventually erupted into a physical confrontation. The exact details differ between sources, but many report that Mahidevran struck Hürrem during a bitter dispute. When Suleiman learned what had happened, his reaction reportedly marked a decisive shift in his favor toward Hürrem. It was more than a quarrel. It was the first visible crack in the old order, and from that moment onward, the palace would never truly be the same again, because the greatest battles of the Ottoman Empire were not always fought on distant battlefields. Sometimes they began behind closed doors, where no army could enter, and where a single woman's rise would soon challenge centuries of imperial tradition. The wedding that shocked the Ottoman world. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been built upon tradition. Sultans conquered kingdoms, commanded vast armies, and ruled over millions. Yet even they were expected to follow certain customs. One of the oldest was this: an Ottoman Sultan did not marry one of his concubines. The dynasty relied on carefully maintained traditions that separated affection from politics. Love, if it existed at all, was never supposed to rewrite the rules of empire. Then Hürrem Sultan did exactly that. The exact date remains debated, but around 1533 or 1534, Sultan Suleiman did something that astonished not only his own court, but diplomats across Europe. He legally married Hurrem. Contemporary Venetian ambassadors struggled to believe what they were witnessing. Reports traveled from Constantinople to Venice, describing an event many thought impossible. A former enslaved woman had become the lawful wife of the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. Pause for a moment and consider what this meant. This was not merely a romantic gesture. It was a political earthquake. The woman who had once arrived at the palace with no family, no title, and no future now held a position no concubine before her had ever occupied. She became Haseki Sultan, a title carrying immense prestige and influence. Every court official understood the message, every prince understood it, every foreign ambassador recognized it. The balance of power had shifted. But with power came fear. Inside the palace, every smile could hide suspicion, every act of kindness could conceal strategy. The imperial court was a place where alliances formed quietly and disappeared just as quickly. Hurrem understood that surviving in such a world required far more than the Sultan's affection. It demanded intelligence, patience, and extraordinary political awareness. Yet one of the greatest misconceptions about Hurrem is that she sought influence through intrigue alone. The historical record tells a broader story. As her position grew stronger, she became an important patron of charitable works. Across the empire, she commissioned mosques, schools, fountains, bathhouses, and hospitals. Her greatest architectural legacy, the Haseki Sultan complex in Constantinople, designed by the legendary imperial architect Mimar Sinan, served the poor through education, medical care, and public kitchens. Long after political rivalries faded, ordinary people continued benefiting from projects she had funded. This was another side of Hürrem Sultan. Not only a woman navigating palace politics, but a woman determined to leave something behind that would outlive them all. Even more remarkable, she began exchanging letters with foreign rulers, including King Sigismund II Augustus of Poland, demonstrating a diplomatic role that few Ottoman women before her had publicly exercised. Her correspondence revealed intelligence, confidence, and an understanding that influence was not measured only by proximity to power, but how wisely it was used. Yet while new buildings rose across the empire, another storm was gathering inside the palace. Because every son born to the Sultan represented both hope and danger. The Ottoman law of succession recognized no automatic eldest heir. Any prince could become Sultan, which meant that every prince was also a rival. And as Suleiman grew older, one question began haunting the empire more than any foreign enemy ever could. Who would inherit the throne? The answer would divide a family, reshape an empire, and leave behind one of the most controversial chapters in Ottoman history. Because the greatest test of Hürrem Sultan's life was no longer winning the Sultan's heart, it was surviving the battle that came after it. Power is rarely tested during times of peace. It is tested when love, loyalty, and survival begin demanding different choices. By the 1540s, Sultan Suleiman stood at the height of his glory. His armies had conquered vast territories. His name inspired admiration in some lands and fear in others. Yet the greatest threat to his reign was no longer beyond the empire's borders. It was inside his own family. To understand what happened next, we must first understand one brutal reality of the Ottoman dynasty. There was no law of primogeniture. The eldest son was not automatically heir to the throne. Every prince possessed a legitimate claim, and Ottoman history had repeatedly shown that succession disputes could plunge the empire into devastating civil war. The fear of brother fighting brother haunted every generation of the dynasty. Among all the princes, Shehzadeh Mustafa, the eldest surviving son of Mahidevran Hatun, stood out above all the rest. Contemporary observers described him as courageous, disciplined, generous, and deeply respected by the army. Foreign ambassadors wrote that many believed Mustafa would one day become sultan. Soldiers admired him. Provincial governors trusted him. Even beyond the empire's borders, European diplomats followed his growing popularity with great interest. But popularity can become dangerous when it begins to resemble power. At the same time, Hurrem's own sons were growing into adulthood. If Mustafa inherited the throne, the future of her children became deeply uncertain. Ottoman succession had long been accompanied by the grim practice of fratricide, legally justified by the dynasty as a way to prevent civil war. A victorious sultan often ordered the execution of his brothers to secure the empire. It was a tradition as tragic as it was terrifying. Imagine living every day knowing that your children's survival might depend on who wore the imperial crown. It is here that history becomes both fascinating and fiercely contested. For centuries, many writers accused Hürrem Sultan and the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, who was married to Hürrem's daughter Mirimah, of conspiring against Prince Mustafa. According to this traditional narrative, they convinced Suleiman that Mustafa intended to overthrow his father. But modern historians urge caution. No surviving Ottoman document proves that Hürrem orchestrated such a conspiracy. Much of the accusation comes from later chronicles, foreign ambassadorial reports colored by rumor, and political narratives written long after the events themselves. What is certain is this: suspicion spread through the court, reports reached the Sultan, and trust slowly began to erode. Then, in 1553, during Suleiman's campaign against Safavid Persia, history reached one of its darkest moments. Prince Mustafa was summoned to his father's military tent. He entered, believing he had been called by the Sultan. He never walked out. On Suleiman's orders, imperial executioners strangled the prince with a silk bowstring, the customary method reserved for members of the Ottoman dynasty. The empire fell silent. Across the provinces, grief spread rapidly. Soldiers wept openly, poets mourned, rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some blamed Suleiman, others blamed Rustem Pasha, many blamed Hurrem. Yet there is one fact that often surprises people. Hürrem Sultan did not live to see the final outcome of the struggle for the throne. She died in 1558, 8 years before Suleiman himself. Whether history remembers her as a devoted wife, a brilliant political mind, and ambitious survivor, or one of the most misunderstood women of the Ottoman Empire, depends on which historian you ask. And that final question is exactly where her extraordinary story reaches its most enduring legacy. History rarely offers perfect heroes, and it almost never offers perfect villains. Hürrem Sultan became both. To some, she was the woman who destroyed an old order. To others, she was the woman who dared to rise above the place society had assigned her. More than 4 centuries after her death, historians still debate her motives, her influence, and her responsibility for the tragedies that unfolded within the Ottoman court. That debate itself tells us something remarkable. She was impossible to ignore. Hürrem Sultan died in April 1558, likely after a prolonged illness. She was around 50 years old. Sultan Suleiman, who had spent decades by her side, personally oversaw her burial near the Süleymaniye Mosque in Constantinople. Even in death, she rested beside the magnificent complex that symbolized her husband's reign, a place where her memory would endure long after the palace intrigues had faded into history. 8 years later, in 1566, Suleiman himself died while leading yet another military campaign. His death marked the end of one of the greatest reigns in Ottoman history. Eventually, Hürrem's son, Selim II, inherited the throne. Did Hürrem live to see her son become sultan? She did not. That is one of history's quiet ironies. The woman so often accused of shaping the succession never witnessed its final outcome. And perhaps that reminds us how dangerous it can be to simplify history into heroes and villains. Because Hürrem's real legacy extends far beyond palace politics. The hospitals she endowed cared for the sick. The public kitchens she founded fed the poor. The schools she commissioned educated generations of children. Her charitable foundations served ordinary people long after those who opposed her had disappeared from the pages of history. Stone outlived rumor. Compassion outlived accusation. Yet myths continued to grow. European writers transformed her into an enchantress who bewitched an emperor. Later novels made her either a ruthless schemer or an impossible romantic heroine. Television dramas added scenes that no contemporary source records. Each generation reshaped Hurrem according to its own imagination. The real woman was undoubtedly more complex. She was a survivor of slavery, a mother, a political advisor, a patron of architecture and charity, a correspondent with foreign rulers, a wife whose marriage broke centuries of Ottoman convention, and above all, a woman who refused to remain powerless in a world designed to keep her silent. Perhaps that is why her story still captivates millions today. Not because every decision she made was beyond criticism, not because every accusation against her can be proved or disproved, but because her life forces us to ask difficult questions. Can power and love truly exist together? Can ambition and compassion belong to the same person? And how much of history is shaped by facts, and how much by the stories later generations choose to tell? Long after the palace walls fell silent, one voice refused to disappear. The voice of a young girl taken from her homeland who entered history as a captive and left it as one of the most influential women the Ottoman Empire would ever know. Because empires rise and fall, but extraordinary stories never truly die.